What's your scariest bone-chilling stories for Halloween? Before we start, welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. I moved to a small town in South Dakota that you can get your license at 14. One night, my friends and I were driving around, exploring the older part of town, which had a charming neighborhood perfect for trick-or-treating. In the midst of the houses, I spotted an old wooden church. As I stared at it, I noticed a woman in white standing on the roof, though it looked more like she was hovering in front of the building near the top. Thinking it was a life-size statue of Mary, I asked why there was such a prominent sculpture on the church, since it seemed a bit out of place for the humble structure. As soon as I spoke up, the driver slammed on the brakes, and everyone turned to look at me in shock. They thought I was joking, but they quickly drove away, not saying a word until I finally asked what was going on. It turns out that church is known for being haunted. A woman jumped off the roof back in the 50s. Legend has it that kids would dare each other to sneak into the off-limits attic, where they'd find small handprints with circles around them, and people often reported hearing children crying. After that night, I made a point to avoid that road. Story 2. When I was around 13, my parents invited our old neighbors from the block of flats we lived in until I was 5. I'd already been sent to bed but could still hear them chatting. Then, the woman neighbor said, "Hey, Digsy's mom, do you remember when Digsy used to complain about someone being in his room? Well, there's a family that just moved in above us, and their 3-year-old son is saying the exact same things." That really creeped me out. I had no memory of any of it. So the next day, I asked my mom about it. Her first reaction was, "You don't remember?" Then she shared all the strange occurrences, footsteps in the hallway, things going missing, and so on. She told me the last incident happened when she was listening to a record one day. It started to slow down, as if someone was gently pressing down on the platter until it finally stopped. At that point, my mom lost it and yelled, "Will you leave us the F alone?" After she shouted that, the record resumed playing normally, and we never had another experience like that again. Since then, I've never encountered anything similar, and while I'm generally skeptical about such stories, I believe my mom. The weirdest part is learning about it from someone else's similar experience a decade later. Story 3. As a young adult, I visited my mom in Tucson, staying in the spare bedroom, which had just a bed, a sewing machine, a nightstand, and a walk-in closet. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a wave of fear, sensing something watching me from the closet. I couldn't bring myself to look directly, but I could tell the closet door was open and dark inside. Whatever was there felt evil and seemed to dislike my presence. After a few minutes of unease, I decided to try to go back to sleep, reminding myself how silly it was to feel so scared, just like when I was a kid. The next morning, I found my mom in the kitchen, focused on her crossword puzzle with coffee in one hand and a cigarette in the other. I began to tell her about the weird experience from the night before. As I spoke, I noticed her looking up more intently, her jaw dropping in surprise. She then explained that a few weeks earlier, when my brother had visited and stayed in the same room, he had described the exact same experience, including his embarrassment over feeling that kind of fear as an adult. To add to the eeriness, the townhouse wasn't old, but it was built on the grounds of the former Tucson Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Story 4. My university campus was divided by a large lake, with a bridge spanning it and a gazebo on an island in the middle. One night, I was walking along the lake, heading to a dorm on the other side. As I approached the bridge, I noticed a kid in a gray and white hoodie, hood up, crossing the part of the bridge closest to me. I didn't think much of it until I passed a large tree that briefly obstructed my view. When I stepped around the tree and glanced back at the bridge, he was gone. There was no way he could have walked off the bridge without passing right by me. And if he had turned around in that split second, he wouldn't have had enough time to get back to the island. He had just vanished. Things got even creepier about a year later when I was about to share this story with a friend who had been studying abroad. Before I could even tell him what I saw, he interrupted, asking, "Wait, did you see a guy in a hoodie disappear?" Turns out, he had experienced something very similar during his freshman year. It was seriously unsettling, and after that I dreaded walking across that bridge alone. Story 5. When I was a kid, the cabinets in my parents' house would slam shut every night after my dad fell asleep. Then, about 7 years ago, after we renovated the house and added an extension, I started seeing a figure in my bedroom doorway at strange times. Sometimes during the day, I would catch a glimpse of a man in a black suit with white hair over my shoulder. As this happened more frequently, I began to question my sanity. The final night, he suddenly burst out of my closet, and I finally saw the terrifying face of this old man. I shut my eyes, screamed, and waited. When I opened my eyes, he was gone, but his image has been burned into my mind ever since. After that night, I never saw him again. A few years later, while home from college for fall break, my family and I went to see a movie. My brothers and I drove home separately from our parents and, with Halloween approaching, started telling scary stories. I shared my experiences with the old man, and to my shock, my youngest brother, who was 16 at the time, started to freak out. He had seen the same man running at him from his closet for the past 2 nights. We've never spoken of it again. Story 6. I grew up in a small town, out in the countryside. One late night, my mom and I were coming home from Walmart and decided to take a back road to avoid traffic. Anyone who's lived in the country knows how eerie these roads can be at night. As I was navigating a curve right before a 1-lane bridge, I slowed down just in case I needed to stop. Suddenly, a woman jumped in front of my car, pounding on the hood. I could see her mouth moving, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. My mom started to panic and urged me not to stop, telling me to keep driving. I pressed on, and when we looked back to see where she had gone, there was no one there. To this day, my mom and I remember that moment vividly. Later, we learned there's a legend about a woman who died near that bridge and is said to appear late at night. Just thinking about it still gives me goosebumps. Story 7. Me and my fiancé live alone in a house we rent together. About 2 years ago, we were lying in bed on a late morning, around 10:30 or 11 a.m. I'd been awake for about 10 or 15 minutes while my fiancé was just starting to stir. We were softly discussing whether to get up or try to catch a bit more sleep since he had the morning off, and we'd been busy the last few days. He lay on his back, gazing at the ceiling, while I faced him, my hand resting on his chest. In that position, my back was turned to the bedroom door, which was about 8 or 9 feet behind me. Then, an unsettling feeling washed over the room. It was as if the air had either been sucked out or had become extremely heavy, making me feel like I was underwater. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt a pressure bearing down on me, distorting my sense of time and making me dizzy. My ears began to pop. At first, I thought it was just me experiencing this strange sensation. I briefly wondered if my blood pressure had dropped, which has happened to me before, but it felt different. Then my fiancé, in a terrified voice that struggled to articulate, asked, "Do you feel that too? What's happening?" That's when I realized something truly strange and frightening was happening, as he was experiencing the exact same thing. I tried to speak, but my words came out slurred, and I had to force them out. "I don't know. I can't move," he replied. "I can't." I saw him struggling to turn onto his side and lift his arm, repeatedly asking, "What's happening? What's happening?" I attempted to raise my own arm, but found it impossible. It felt like I was underwater, trapped in a suffocating pressure. I tried to push myself up to sit, but it was just too heavy. Then we both heard it, the doorknob of our bedroom door turning. It was rotating rhythmically, as if someone were trying to enter without jiggling the handle. Instead, it turned back and forth in a steady tempo, almost like a metronome, deliberate and unnerving. Panic set in, and we froze. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but why would they turn the knob like that? Our bedroom door had no lock. They could just walk in. We were still pinned down by that strange heaviness, unable to move, but I could feel my fiancé struggling just like I was. All I managed to do was slowly turn my head to glance over my shoulder at the doorknob, watching it twist. Then we heard it singing. 2 young girls' voices chimed in, singing a tune that I couldn't quite catch, except for the last word of each line, dancing. To clarify, their voices were like a playful nursery rhyme, synchronized with the turning of the doorknob. Click, 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 as they sang, "We are dancing. Something, something, we are dancing." The doorknob turned in time with each lyric, perfectly in sync. I couldn't decipher most of their song, but dancing was the only word I clearly heard at the end of each stanza. They sang in a playful, teasing way, like 2 little girls would when they're trying to annoy an older sibling or a parent, shaking the doorknob and singing just to be silly. The song had that whimsical, made-up quality kids sometimes have when they're being goofy. It almost sounded like they were giggling, trying not to laugh while they sang. As all this unfolded, I slowly turned my head back to my fiancé to see if he was experiencing the same thing. He finally managed to shift his gaze toward the doorknob, and the look on his face is one I'll never forget. His eyes were wide with shock, looking as if they were about to pop out of his head. He was completely pale. Then the song came to an abrupt end. It was short, just 2 stanzas, and as soon as the last word, dancing, left their lips, the doorknob stopped turning. In that instant, the heavy, dizzy sensation that had pinned us down lifted completely. Just like that, we could move again, and the air felt normal. It all happened so quickly, maybe in about 10 seconds. My fiancé sat up, bewildered, and exclaimed, "What the hell just happened?" He jumped over me, dashed to the door, and flung it open. Nothing was there. Our small house had no hallway. Our bedroom door led straight into the living room. He peered out and said, "Nobody's out there." I got up and rushed to join him. The house was empty, and our two cats were huddled against the far wall, hissing and growling. They must have sensed something, or even seen what had happened. From the spot in front of our bedroom door, a trail of heat stretched through the living room, dining room, and out toward the kitchen. I can't explain it, just a wave of warmth that felt almost oily, creating a hazy fog in the air. We checked both the front and kitchen doors. Locked. Both locked. We sat back down on the bed, still trembling. We kept asking each other, did that really just happen? We both heard it, right? And yes, we both felt that pressure pinning us down, the doorknob turning rhythmically, and those two little girls singing. It was clear this wasn't a hallucination. The only difference was that my fiancé caught a few more lyrics. He thought he heard something like, "And we come in dancing," or "And we go dancing." It was unsettling, to say the least. Their voices didn't sound malicious. I was like two little girls having fun and teasing us. There was nothing threatening about it, yet it still sent chills down our spines. We were on edge for the rest of the day, and I practically begged him not to leave for work that afternoon, but he had to go. While he was at work, I kept every light on in the house and had both TVs running, one in the living room and one in our bedroom. It's never happened again, but even now, just talking about it gives both of us the creeps. Story 8. When I was around 10 or 12, I had a strange experience that still sticks with me. At the time, I shared a room with my sister, and I slept on the top bunk of our lofted beds. We had a stereo on a desk across the room. When you pressed the power button, it made a distinct click, and a red light would turn on. One night, I was jolted awake by that familiar click. Sitting up, I noticed the light on the stereo had turned on. I glanced at my sister, who was sound asleep beneath me. The stereo was emitting that white noise sound it makes when not tuned to a station. Suddenly, I heard a voice coming from the stereo, saying one word, "Away." It started softly, gradually growing louder, until it erupted into a yell. "Away, away, away." This build-up took about 10 to 15 seconds, and then it faded back down to a whisper. I was frozen in fear, convinced I must be dreaming. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, but just as I nearly convinced myself, the voice disappeared. The stereo returned to static, and then I heard the familiar click again as the light turned off. I was certain I wasn't dreaming that last click. I stared at the stereo for a few moments, too scared to move. I looked back at my sister, still fast asleep, then finally laid down, pulled the sheets over me, and tried to will myself back to sleep. I consider myself a rational person, but I had no logical explanation for what had just happened. It remains the freakiest thing I've ever experienced. Story 9. I work security at night, and a few years ago, I was stationed at an old army barracks on the outskirts of my city, which had been converted into an international tech company. One night, while heading up to the canteen, I reached the top of the stairs and glanced to my right through the small window of a door. If I'd been in a cartoon, I would have frozen in place trying to flee because there was a guy staring right back at me. The building was centuries old, and I was already on edge, bracing for something unsettling. But when I went to check it out, I was relieved to discover it was just my own reflection. Story 10. I used to volunteer at a nursing home where we often encountered new residents who accurately described former residents, even down to specific nightgowns or the color of their glasses. Staff and I recognized these individuals as people who had passed away in that very room, and some residents even complained about them visiting at night. One day, while walking through the hallway, which was usually uncomfortably warm, I suddenly felt a chill and got goosebumps. A CNA mentioned that I had just walked through a ghost, and I couldn't shake the cold for the rest of the day. We experienced flickering lights and TVs turning on by themselves. Many staff members, who hailed from the same Southeast Asian country, often discussed ghosts and the importance of respecting the dead. The situation became so concerning that management arranged for a candlelight ceremony. A woman with crystals and dreadlocks came in to perform a sage brushing. After that, things calmed down significantly. The lights stayed on more consistently, and the residents seemed much more at ease. Story 11. In 2002, my family moved to a house in a small Kansas town. I was 10, and my brother was 12. From the moment we arrived, I felt uneasy and even told my mom I thought it was haunted. Our bedrooms were upstairs, while the piano I dreaded was located downstairs in the dining room, to the left of the stairs, past the kitchen. My brother loved to mess with me by playing the piano and then hiding. He often did this at night, just before bed, which gave me terrible nightmares and made it hard for me to sleep without a light on. Years later, my mom revealed that she had experienced doors slamming and cabinets opening when we weren't home. One day, my brother and I were playing Mario Kart 64, actually getting along for once, when I heard the piano again. I told my brother, "Very funny, you got one of your friends to come over and play the piano to scare me." He looked terrified and replied, "I thought you were doing it." We paused our game, and my brother grabbed a bat, telling me to follow him. I took my BB gun, and we cautiously headed down the stairs. When we reached the bottom step, the music suddenly stopped. The house was eerily silent. No windows were open, and the AC was off. We could faintly hear Mario Kart still playing in the background. My brother froze in fear, and I nervously declared, "I don't know who you are, but I've got a loaded gun, so you better leave." As we turned left into the kitchen, we were shocked to see all the cabinets, the fridge, and the freezer doors wide open. The piano key cover was also open, yet all the doors were locked. We panicked, and my brother called our mom to explain what was happening. She reassured us and said she was on her way home. As we started to close the cabinets, I glanced up at the door at the top of the stairs. Suddenly, it slammed shut with such force that it knocked a picture of me off the wall, shattering the glass. I freaked out, shot my BB gun at the door, and ran away screaming. My brother bolted out the other door, and we both ended up sitting in the front yard when our mom arrived. We explained everything to her, and that night, we went to stay at my dad's house for the week. My mom decided to move us out, saying she had experienced several similar incidents and didn't feel safe there. Several years later, the landlord was found dead in the basement. He used a shotgun to unalive himself. I'm not going to say I believe in ghosts or it was haunted, but I don't know what it was that day, and I don't want to know, to be honest. I couldn't sleep with the lights off until I was 16. Story 12. During my senior year of high school, my parents traveled out of the country, and my brother stayed with a friend. I lived on the outskirts of a large town in a fairly wooded area. Without any pets of my own, I was surprised to hear barking outside. Being a bit reckless, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured out. I spotted a yellow dog running around my yard, chasing something. It suddenly stopped, stared at me, and then took off. Thinking I had scared it, I went back inside and settled in a bed, almost ready to sleep. But then I heard the most chilling sound, something I can't quite describe, but it was horrid and terrifying. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went downstairs to investigate. Definitely the worst decision ever. Once I was downstairs, I saw a figure outside that looked completely unnatural. I was frozen, watching this person wander around my yard for a few minutes. Then, to my shock, they looked directly at me. This startled me for two reasons. First, the blinds were closed, and I was peeking through a small crack. Second, all the lights in the house were off, so I knew I wasn't casting a shadow. The only reason I could see anything was because of the full moon. We held eye contact for what felt like an eternity, and then I rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, the figure was gone. As for the sound, many have asked me to describe it. It was almost like a shriek, but not high-pitched, something beyond words. The figure was equally hard to describe. It wore very dark clothing, nearly pitch black, and its skin was pale. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze on me. Story 13. I don't usually believe in things that can't be explained by logic or history, but for some reason, a bump in the night or a string of strange events can really unsettle me. It was the summer of 2007, and I was madly in love. I spent nearly every day at my girlfriend's house, where her massive bedroom felt like something out of a sitcom. It had a couch and a big TV, the perfect spot for us to waste a summer wrapped up in each other. Directly above her room was a converted attic that served as her older brother's room. He hadn't lived there for a few years since graduating college, but I knew he was back and forth that summer. One evening, while we were watching a movie, I heard a lot of noise coming from upstairs, like someone was moving things around, settling in. When the movie ended, we planned to head downstairs for some food, and I mentioned wanting to say hi to Mark. We'll call him that for anonymity. My girlfriend looked puzzled and told me Mark wasn't home. I tried to explain the noises, convinced she was playing a trick on me, but eventually shrugged it off and went downstairs. After a few more hours together, I gathered my things to head home. It was around 2 a.m., and as I kissed her goodnight in the foyer, loud music suddenly filled the air. It was jarring, upbeat music from the 40s or 50s blaring from upstairs. My girlfriend's face went pale as we realized it was coming from her brother's room. We cautiously made our way up the stairs, holding onto each other tightly, and followed the sound into her brother's bathroom. Sure enough, in the pitch black, a radio was playing. I flicked on the bathroom light and switched off the radio. Confused, she stared at it, noting that this radio usually stayed on the second floor. The incident was strange, but I managed to calm her down enough to head to bed. I got into my car for the 20 to 30-minute drive home. As I drove through the neighborhood, I noticed that the streetlights seemed to flicker out as I passed beneath them. I tried to push it from my mind and drove faster. Up ahead, I approached a construction zone where the road narrowed significantly. Suddenly, a small figure darted into the road, maybe a child. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. But just like that, the engine sputtered and died. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, scanning for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness, playing tricks on me. In a panic, I tried to restart my car, but nothing happened. I grabbed my cell phone and called my girlfriend. No answer. I tried my parents. No answer. After another attempt, the engine finally roared back to life. Story 14. A good friend of mine, now a neurosurgeon, had an unsettling experience during his time as a young intern. After checking in on a dying patient and making her comfortable, he sat down in a nearby chair to write his report. A few minutes later, he looked up and was shocked to see the same patient walking down the hallway. He called out to her, but she didn't respond. As he stood to follow her, she vanished. He hurried back to the patient's room and noticed a light shining under the door. When he opened it, however, the room was completely dark. He switched on the nightlight and went over to check her pulse, only to find that she had passed away. He is convinced of what he saw that night. Was it her spirit? Story 15. While I was in university studying biology, I developed a passion for finding snakes. A friend from the herpetology club took me to a back road. He often cruised for snakes at night. Cruising involves driving slowly along these secluded roads to spot snakes basking on the warm pavement. The road we explored was about 4 miles long with only a handful of houses. After several laps, we were making our final pass when we noticed movement on the left side of the road. It wasn't unusual to see animals there, but what we saw next was startling. A young boy, around 8 or 9, wearing torn blue jeans and a ripped dark t-shirt. His face showed a mix of fear and pain. He glanced back over his shoulder before darting across the road. My friend jumped out of the car to see if the boy was okay, and I pulled up to where he had entered the woods. As I started to get out, my friend hurried back and urgently said, "Let's go now." We quickly hopped in the car and sped away. He told me there was a graveyard about 10 yards into the woods, containing 5 gravestones, all with the same death date. One of them belonged to a 9-year-old boy. We avoided that road for the rest of the summer, though we usually visited once or twice a week. The following year, after my friend graduated, I took my girlfriend there. We arrived early to search for different types of snakes, reaching the area near the graveyard where 3 men were working in their yard. I rolled down the window, explained what we were doing, and asked about the graveyard. They shared that their uncle's family had tragically died in a fire caused by a space heater about 20 years ago. As I pressed for details, they revealed that while the firefighters found all the bodies, the youngest son was missing, assumed to have perished in the flames. When I asked if they had a little brother, one of the men, a towering 6 feet 4 inches and 250 pounds, replied that he was the youngest. When I described the boy I had seen, their faces went pale. Each of them had individually encountered the boy I described, and he always ran toward the gravesite. I never returned to that road again. Later, I called Todd, my friend from that night, to see if he remembered the incident. At first, I thought the call had dropped, but then he said, "Do you want to know what I really saw?" Naturally, I said yes. He revealed that when he reached the gravesite, he had seen the boy face down in front of one of the markers, crying. At that moment, he noticed my car lights approaching through the trees. When he looked back at the boy, he was gone. Realizing the significance of the gravestones, he decided to leave immediately. Story 16. After returning from a restaurant, my mom, sister, and I heard loud banging noises coming from upstairs. We were all in the kitchen and paused our activities, straining to listen. My mom told my sister, who was playing with her remote control car, to keep going so it wouldn't look suspicious that we were eavesdropping. Just then, another loud bang echoed through the house. My mom and sister panicked and rushed toward the door, while I started tying my shoes to follow them. But my mom dragged me out barefoot, insisting we get to my dad, who was working a few miles away on the farm. Afterward, we searched the entire house, but found nothing unusual. Eventually, we discovered that my sister's remote control car had the same frequency as my other remote control car. While she was playing downstairs, she had been accidentally controlling my car upstairs, causing it to crash into doors and walls. It's still a funny story we share, even 10 years later. Story 17. During my sophomore year of high school, I often waited for my mom to drive me to school after getting ready. One morning, I was hanging out in the bathroom while she put on her makeup and curled her hair. She seemed a bit frazzled, so I asked if everything was okay. She shared a strange experience from the night before. Around 2 a.m., she had been woken by a persistent noise. It wasn't loud, but it was continuous enough to be annoying. My dad, of course, slept through it, which wasn't surprising since he could sleep through anything. Curious, she started looking for the source. First, she checked the bathroom attached to their room, but found nothing. Then she heard the noise coming from a nearby bathroom. When she walked in, she discovered a hairdryer plugged in and turned on, just sitting on the bath mat. Though it was odd with 4 kids in the house, she figured someone must have sleepwalked and turned it on. She unplugged it and put it away, then returned to bed and eventually fell asleep. About an hour later, she woke up again to the same noise, now coming from downstairs. Annoyed, she went to check it out again and traced the sound to the guest bathroom in the main entry hall. When she opened the door, there was another hairdryer turned on, lying in the middle of the floor. By this point, she was freaked out but still unplugged it and put it away. Sleep was hard to come by after that. As she finished telling me the story, we both froze and turned to look at the walk-in closet off her bathroom. Just then, the entire light fixture on the ceiling shattered. Not just the bulb, but the glass cover, sending shards everywhere. We both jumped and ran out, shaken. We had never experienced anything like that before or since, and none of my family members had either. Story 18. I grew up in a stunning 150-year-old Victorian house. My sister and I were convinced it was haunted, but we always figured the ghosts were friendly. When I was 5, it was bedtime, and I was hanging out in my mom's room while my dad was away on business. I somehow convinced her to let me sleep in her room that night. On her dresser sat a large, old music box, an heirloom made of dark wood with floral inlays, about the size of a microwave. It played a song from the Nutcracker, and as a dedicated 5-year-old ballerina, I thought it was the most wonderful thing ever, even though I was strictly forbidden to touch it. That night, as I settled into bed, my mom went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. Just before closing the door, she reminded me not to touch the music box. I snuggled under the blankets, enjoying the summer breeze flowing through the curtains, when suddenly a note chimed from the music box. Then another. Before I knew it, the box burst into full song, playing as if it were on its last breath. I froze in fear, then jumped up to turn it off, just as my mom stepped out of the bathroom and caught me opening the lid. I broke down sobbing, huge, choking tears. I tried to explain that the house was haunted and that the music had started on its own. I promised her, I swear I didn't touch it. The ghosts are going to get me. I was convinced we were about to meet our doom. To this day, I remember the tightness of panic in my chest, feeling like something else was in the room with us. My mom dismissed my fears, thinking I was lying. I climbed back into bed, sobbing myself to sleep, frustrated that she didn't believe me and terrified that the ghosts would come for me in the night. That was 20 years ago. My mom sold the family house last winter, and she still insists the music didn't start on its own. Story 19. In high school, I woke up in the middle of the night and opened my eyes to find a guy I'd never seen before standing over me. He was wearing a flannel shirt and staring right at me. I remember throwing the covers over my head, my heart racing like never before. After a moment, I pulled the covers down and he was gone. I still remember it vividly. I don't usually believe in paranormal experiences, but that was no dream. I saw him clearly, standing right next to my bed, looking down without moving or making a sound. Story 20. When I was 15, I was walking home from the train station around 10 p.m. It was a narrow pedestrian-only road with the railway on the other side and very few streetlights for visibility. As I walked down this long stretch, I spotted a strange, white figure in the distance, a blurry spot at the end of the road. The street was completely straight, so I could see it relatively clearly. As I got closer, closer, my fight or flight response kicked in. I wasn't sure if I should turn back, or, being the level-headed person I usually am and a skeptic of the supernatural, just keep going. As I approached, I realized it was a woman dressed almost entirely in white. That struck me as odd, so I quickened my pace, hoping to get past her faster. When I got closer, I saw she was wearing a full wedding gown, complete with a veil. I could barely make out her face through the veil's blurriness and the darkness of the night. At this point, my heart was racing, and I struggled to process what I was seeing. I also noticed something very strange about how she moved. She appeared to be floating or gliding along the ground. I couldn't see her legs beneath the dress. But that's not where it ends. After I finally passed her, an encounter that felt like it lasted forever, I picked up my pace to a jog, too scared to look back. After I had passed about 4 or 5 houses, curiosity and fear compelled me to glance back. She was gone. I ran to the nearest cross street, and I haven't set foot on that road since. Keep in mind, there were no side streets, and the other side was a railway track. Sure, she could have gone into one of the houses, but what were the odds? And why was she wearing a wedding gown in the middle of the night? Those questions still haunt me. Oh, and one last detail. She was incredibly tall, definitely over 6 feet. Story 21. My wife and I buy our first house in February of 2010. We immediately fell in love with it as soon as we laid eyes on it. It had everything we wanted and plus a few extras. For the first month, everything was great. Lots of painting and decorating, getting it just the way we wanted. Then, weird things started to randomly happen. First, it was small things like things upstairs being moved, put in completely different rooms than where they belonged. I chalked it up to my wife just forgetting to put things back where they belonged. The house also started to creak, pretty loud. This is a fairly new house. I just figured it was probably settling, as most new houses tend to do. One day, the wife and I was preparing dinner in the kitchen. Our stairs sit right next to the kitchen entrance, so any noises upstairs were clearly audible into the kitchen. I turned off the water at the sink, and as soon as I did, we both heard a cough. We have no kids, and no one was visiting. The windows were all shut. The television was not on. This sent the coldest chill down my spine, and I could feel the blood running out of my face. I looked to my wife, and she too had gone pale and had this look of absolute fear. Someone was in our house, and they were upstairs. I quickly grabbed the sharpest knife I could find, and my wife called the police. I walked to the bottom of the steps and stood silently and heard a loud pop/creak, just like the ones I had always heard the house make. My hands were shaking, and my wife was whispering to the 911 operator, telling them we think we may have a robber in our home. The police arrive in minutes. Thankfully, they had been patrolling nearby. The officer walks slowly up the stairs, gun drawn. He calls out, "This is the police. Is anyone upstairs?" No response. I'm right behind him, walking up the stairs. We look into the first bedroom and closet. Empty. No one in the half bath either. Last room is my office where I have my PC. No one in the room or the closet. I felt the tension ease away and felt like a complete tool, making this officer search the house, only to find nothing. We turn to walk out of the room, and right above us, creak. I just about shat bricks. In my office closet, there is an attic access. The officer pulls the steps down and again calls out, "Is anyone up there?" This is the police. No response. He turns on his flashlight and peeks his head up. He finds a man in his 40s, kneeling there in the attic, looking dead at him, gun drawn. He tells the man to come out and put his hands behind his head. They arrest the man. He didn't say a word the whole time and would not look anyone in the eye. He was scruffy looking and had dirty clothes on. Me and my wife were freaking out. I don't think either of us have fully gotten over it. After questioning the man in the police station, we found out that he was a homeless man who found refuge in the house while it was still on the market. He said the doors were unlocked, and so he stayed there. Apparently, a realtor must have forgotten to lock the door after showing someone the house. He said that when people would come to the house, he would hide in the second-floor attic. We bought the house, and this guy was living in it for a whole month without us even knowing. It really freaks me out still just thinking about it. Story 22. To this day, the scariest thing that ever happened to me was when I lived near the woods and could see a cemetery from my back porch. One Easter morning, I woke up to see the Easter Bunny, one of those terrifying costumes, and I still vividly remember the smell of wet hay. I didn't tell anyone at the time, but later that day, I found an extra Easter egg in the house that my parents hadn't hidden. Years later, while I was in high school, I asked my parents if they had ever dressed up as the Easter Bunny and snuck into our room. They laughed and said it was too much trouble. Then my younger sister, who I shared a bunk bed with during that time, chimed in, saying she remembered the Easter Bunny coming into our room and making a comment about the hay smell. I was terrified to realize we both had the same memory of a person in a bunny costume in our room. To make it even creepier, I shared this story with my lunch table. One of the girls who lived across the street from me revealed that one Easter night, she had looked out her window and seen the Easter Bunny standing in her driveway. Chills ran down my spine. To this day, I can't shake my fear of people in rabbit costumes. Story 23. When my niece was really little, I was babysitting her at my sister's house. She was happily bouncing in her bouncer while I stepped into the kitchen to grab some water. I could hear her giggling, likely because my sister's chocolate labs were sniffing and licking her head. I didn't notice how much colder it had gotten until I heard it, a loud, sharp snap like a thick piece of wood breaking or a tree falling. I rushed back into the room, and what I saw and smelled sent chills down my spine. The dogs were huddled in the corner, whimpering, while my niece stared wide-eyed at the corner of the ceiling. It felt icy, and the air smelled strongly of Stetson cologne. I quickly took her to another room. When my sister finally came home, I told her what happened. She just rolled her eyes and said, "That's Hugh." I was confused until she explained that Hugh was the previous owner who had died 10 years before his wife sold the house. She said he liked to follow my niece around, and you could always tell it was him because the dogs would freak out, the temperature would drop, and there would be a scent of cheap cologne. I don't usually believe in that kind of stuff, but I trust the gut feeling you get when something seems off. Now I babysit my niece in my own house. Sorry, Hugh. Story 24. I worked as a campus security guard, tasked with ensuring no one was in the buildings after midnight. One night, at 1 a.m., I was checking the old psychiatric building, one of the few on campus without constant lighting. We weren't allowed to turn on lights, as someone might see them from outside and call the police, wasting everyone's time. So, I only had my flashlight. Patrolling the top floor was incredibly eerie. This building had been acquired by the campus in the early 1900s. It was originally a psychiatric ward before being converted into a biochemistry building. Suddenly, I heard a door creaking behind me. When I turned to check it out, I saw a tall man, about 6 feet, standing in the dark. I screamed and bolted out of there. In my panic, I tripped on the last flight of stairs and tumbled down. Unfortunately, I landed just as my boss, an on-duty police officer, was coming in, drawn by my scream. I told her someone was upstairs, but when she followed me back in, she was carrying a wooden statue of Sacagawea. I had no idea what it was doing there, but that moment really freaked me out. Story 25. A few weeks ago, I was walking my dog late at night when I spotted a woman about a block away, coming toward me on the same sidewalk. The street was completely deserted, just the two of us. As she got closer, I noticed she was shuffling along in shabby clothes, dragging one foot behind her. Her head was lowered to her chest, and her hair hung down, obscuring her face. When she was about 20 feet away, I started to feel uneasy. She looked really strange and was moving faster than I expected. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but tried to convince myself I was being silly. Stay calm, I told myself. I attempted to guide my dog to the right to avoid her, but he wasn't having it. As she approached, only a foot away, she lifted her head slightly and croaked, "Hello, dear," before passing me by. She seemed to have some sort of disability, but I swear she looked like a zombie and scared the living daylights out of me. Story 26. My cousins and I were playing in my grandparents' basement, a long room perfect for games like red light, green light. The basement had a creepy vibe, but with 5 of us, it was the best place to play since the longest stretch was near the stairs. There were also a couple of bedrooms and a laundry/storage room down there. In one of the bedrooms, my grandmother had this dancing sunflower that was motion-activated and sang, "You Are My Sunshine." Suddenly, while we were playing, that eerie little sunflower started singing from the dark back bedroom, even though none of us were close enough to trigger it. We all screamed and raced for the stairs, terrified. That moment made the basement even creepier for us, and to this day, we still remember it vividly. Story 27. Years ago, I was performing in a community theater production of Harvey in a charming old theater. Backstage, there was a dressing room on the left side and a dark, somewhat creepy passage you had to navigate if you entered or exited from the right side. During one show, after exiting through the stage right door, I decided to hang out nearby since I was due back on stage soon. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching from the creepy walkway, definitely the sound of a woman in high heels. It was quiet enough that the audience wouldn't notice, but unmistakable to me. The footsteps seemed to get closer, pause, shift, and then walk away. Thinking it might be one of the actresses wanting to chat, I ventured into the dark passage but found no one there. I made my way to the dressing room, where two ladies were preparing, both in sneakers since that was part of their costumes. It struck me then that no one in the play wore high heels, so who had I heard? I had to make my entrance, so I couldn't linger, but afterward, when I mentioned the footsteps, no one could figure out who it could have been. There was no way anyone could have snuck back there if they weren't part of the production, and even the crew wore soft shoes to avoid making noise during the performance. Afterward, I heard more stories about a lady rumored to haunt the theater. I tend to be skeptical, and while my actor friends could pull a prank or two, they would have definitely laughed and said something like, "You should have seen your face," if they were behind it. Story 28. Years ago, a good friend of mine recounted an eerie experience from his high school days. He often stayed up late reading in a room he shared with his brother in a 5-bedroom house filled with 8 kids. One night, as he lay on his side engrossed in a book, he suddenly felt a weight at the end of his bed, as if someone had sat down. Looking across the room, he saw his brother sound asleep. Curious, he lowered his book and was shocked to see a man in overalls with a long, shaggy beard walking away from his bed before vanishing into thin air. I probed him with questions, wondering if he had simply fallen asleep or imagined it. But he insisted, "I saw and felt what I'm telling you." He was not one to exaggerate or joke around. This wasn't an isolated incident. It happened a few more times. On another occasion, while getting a glass of water late at night, he stepped off the final stair into the hallway and spotted the same bearded figure again. After a few moments, the apparition disappeared. Finally, he confided in his father, a retired lieutenant colonel from the Air Force. To his surprise, his father admitted he had also seen the figure, but had kept quiet to avoid frightening the other kids. An older brother later revealed he too had encountered the mysterious man. Now, 30 years later, whenever I ask my friend about it, he responds the same way. Yes, it's true. He's since become a respected college professor at a prestigious university and is as grounded as they come. Story 29. I'm an au pair in Sweden and spend most summer weekends at my family's summer house in the archipelago outside Stockholm. It's a stunningly beautiful spot, but Buenos doesn't even begin to describe it. The nearest neighbor is a brisk 30-minute walk away, and beyond that, it's just ocean and dense, eerie forest. One particular night was date night for the parents, so I was left alone with the 2 kids in this somewhat spooky murder house. There are 2 buildings on the property, the main house and a guest house, where I would be sleeping all by myself, just a couple of meters from the ocean. The plan was to explore the forest, something I had only done with the parents, and then head to the bus stop to pick up my boyfriend. He would stay with us until the parents returned, and then we'd sleep in the guest house. While we were in the forest, I couldn't shake the jitters. Things felt off, and it wasn't just because I was alone with the kids. I grew up in the woods, so I know the sounds, but several times we heard birds making strange distress calls, causing large flocks to take flight long before we could have startled them. We also heard heavy footsteps nearby, which had me worried there might be an aggressive moose lurking around. We stumbled upon a secluded lake, and that's when things got even weirder. Despite the isolation, there was a naked woman sitting on a rock about 60 feet away, looking like she'd just come from swimming, even though the water was far too cold for that. When she spotted us, she stood up and began pacing, moving toward the water and then retreating, as if she wanted to cross the lake to approach us, but was held back by the water. The kids were uneasy, and I quickly ushered them back the way we came. On the way to pick up my boyfriend, I felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched, which really terrified me. We met him without incident and returned to the cabin just as the sun was setting. After feeding the kids, as they settled in with a Swedish comic book, the main door suddenly slammed open. I was convinced it was a real person entering. There was a heavy footfall followed by a loud bang, like someone had forcefully flung the door open. But when my boyfriend checked outside, there was no one there. "Must have been the wind," he said, but I wasn't so sure. It's always the wind, right? While we were in bed reading, we could hear skittering and clawing sounds coming from beneath us. I knew for sure that there were rats and other rodents at the other end of the house, near the kitchen, but I tried to ignore it. My boyfriend, ever the rational one, reassured me that it was probably just a fox or a weasel and told me not to worry. Fast forward to 3 a.m. I needed to pee. We were in the guest house, and my bosses had returned home a while ago. I'm no stranger to peeing outside, so I stumbled into the darkness and squatted down behind the guest house. Right after I stood up and adjusted my shirt, that awful feeling of dread washed over me again. I had felt it in the forest on my way to see my boyfriend, and while we were inside the house. I had been fine in the guest house, but now the anxiety returned. Behind the guest house is a steep hill, about a 45-degree angle, where an old, vacant structure we call the ghost house sits. It used to belong to a soldier from the 1600s, and now it's just a creepy, abandoned place. There's a trail from the ghost house to the main summer home, lit by dim solar lamps, more decorative than useful. They barely illuminate the path, but the idea was to help us avoid tripping over roots. As I stood there, I sensed something moving up the trail, heading from the main house to the ghost house. I squinted into the darkness and saw what looked like a person, but that didn't make sense. In the solar light, you'd see colors, jeans, shirts, jackets, and ours all had reflectors. This figure was just a black shadow. I considered that it might be an animal, but quickly ruled it out. It was on 2 legs and moving incredibly fast and smoothly. Then it slowed down as if it had noticed me. I was genuinely terrified. Thank goodness I had just peed, but my instinct told me to hold my ground, so I did. As I strained to see in the dark, I suddenly noticed 2 softly illuminated eyes fixed on me. They changed color from bluish to yellowish as they moved in relation to the solar lamps, catching the light. So I stared back. The figure slowed even more, and I could hear twigs snapping, making it clear this was no hallucination. It was actually walking. Then the strangest thing happened. Instead of moving at a normal height, the eyes began to hover. They shifted between 6 feet and 4 feet off the ground, never leaving my gaze while still progressing up the hill. Eventually, the eyes and the figure faded into the darkness beyond the reach of the solar lamps. I hurried back into the guest house and locked the door, hearing nothing else that night. My boyfriend slept through it all, but when he woke up early in the morning, he was whimpering from a nightmare. That was the only unusual thing that ever happened at that summer house, and I had spent a whole month there. Story 30. I've shared this before in a couple of threads, but it still really freaks me out. When I was about 17, I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. We had a place on the top floor, and often went up to the roof to smoke. One night, just as we were about to head up, I realized I needed to pee, so I told him I'd meet him there. After I finished, I climbed the stairs to the attic that led to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to find our way. The attic was old, creepy, and cluttered. As I approached the roof door, I noticed a shadow pass by me. I thought it was my friend, so I kept calling out, insisting I knew it was him and to stop messing around. The shadow moved past me a few more times before I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He had gotten a call from his girlfriend and had been in another room talking to her the entire time. I have no idea what that shadow figure was, but it really unsettled me. I told my friend what had happened and said I didn't want to go back up there. A couple of things to consider that have come up before when I've shared this story. First, it couldn't have been my own shadow because the only light came from my phone, which I held in front of me. Second, it wasn't someone who had broken in, as that door locked from the outside. The next day, my friend checked during daylight, and there was no one there. Story 31. Not me, but my mom has a chilling story about the house I live in, which she and my uncle grew up in. Built in the early 1960s, it sits in a small neighborhood on a hill that hasn't seen much expansion since. Across the street is what we call the Mickey House, a tiny one-story home with a walk-in basement. I've never seen anyone live there or maintain it. It's filled with old furniture and junk, but seems abandoned. When my mom was little, there was drama surrounding my grandfather's job that made him paranoid about leaving my grandmother and the kids alone. One day, while napping with my uncle, my mom woke up and decided to check the window which faced the Mickey house. To her shock, she saw a man in a Mickey Mouse mask sitting on a glider on the porch, dressed in black, and watching them. She screamed, waking her uncle, which prompted the adults to rush outside with guns. As they did, the masked figure bolted around the back of the house. The next morning, my grandfather discovered his tires had been slashed. Years later, my cousins and I ventured into the Mickey house's basement, which was unlocked. We explored the clutter, including an old baby crib, and eventually found a large wooden door. Curiosity got the best of us, and we opened it, revealing a cold, musty space with a canoe and a plastic tarp. The air was chilling, and despite our hopes for a thrilling encounter, we ended up too spooked to step inside, shutting the door and fleeing the property. Story 32. When I was around 16, my rapidly growing family finally moved out of the house where I had spent my entire life. While packing, we fondly reminisced about our favorite moments, and one day, I retreated to the downstairs closet with a flashlight to read, just like I used to do for some peace and quiet. This deep under-the-stairs closet stretched about 8 feet back before turning left into a low space filled with old blankets and stuffed animals, making it the coziest spot to curl up with a book. About an hour in, as I shifted to get comfortable, I suddenly heard a low, warped voice say, "You always make me happy." I freaked out, bumped my head on the ceiling, and nearly broke down the door in my rush to escape. After I calmed down and explained to my family why I looked terrified, I went back to investigate. It turned out to be my old stuffed little bear, which I had unknowingly leaned against just right to press its belly. However, when I pressed it again, nothing happened. This poor bear, which I hadn't touched since I was a toddler, must have used its last bit of power to tell me I made it happy. You make me happy too, little bear, I thought, just not while I'm busy freaking out. Story 33. When I was about 7 or 8 years old, I lived in a large house in the English countryside. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors, one to my room and my older brother's, and the other to my 2 sisters' room. One night, as I was about to fall back asleep in the dim light of the moon shining through our door, I heard the old door creak open. To my horror, I saw a woman standing there in a white nightgown, her long black hair obscuring her face. I could hear her heavy breathing, and terrified, I forced myself to go back to sleep, chalking it up to imagination. A couple of days later, I woke up again to the same creaking noise. This time, I lifted my head from under the blankets to find the woman was no longer in the doorway, but in my room on all fours, making a strange, choking noise. Again, I buried myself under the blankets and tried to sleep. Fast forward 7 years, I finally brought it up with my mom and older brother, who both gasped and froze at my story. They revealed that in our new house, my brother regularly saw the same woman walking around the garden at night, while my mom often woke to find her entering her room and heading toward a creepy hatch in her walk-in wardrobe that we all avoided. So yeah, I definitely lived in a haunted cottage. Story 34. I was staying at my beach condo in South Carolina with my boyfriend when something woke me up abruptly in the middle of the night. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, and I thought I saw a tall black shadow moving toward my boyfriend's side of the bed. Assuming it was him returning from the bathroom, I half asleep asked if he'd gone. When he didn't respond, I finally got a clear look, and my heart dropped. There was a tall, dark figure with shoulder-length hair and a huge nose, just staring at my boyfriend. Panicking, I reached over and found my boyfriend sound asleep, which sent me into a scream. I've never felt so terrified in my life. Afterward, I did some research and discovered that many women have reported seeing a similar figure watching their boyfriends or husbands. It's so bizarre. Thankfully, I haven't encountered it again, but some of the women mentioned seeing it frequently. To this day, I have no idea what it was or if my mind was just playing tricks on me, but the experience felt far too vivid and real for me to dismiss as imagination, especially since I was woken from a deep sleep. Story 35. I've experienced a lot of strange things in my life, but this one stands out as the creepiest. A few years ago, I was living in a small Georgia town near the South Carolina border, renting a house with a large property. Our nearest neighbor was about a quarter-mile away. One day, while I was in the kitchen making lunch, I heard kids playing outside, followed by an older woman yelling for them, then a horrifying scream, a blood-curdling, life-or-death scream. I rushed out the back door, only to find a field full of grazing cows. It hit me that I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was no way kids could be that close to my kitchen window. I walked around the property, but didn't see anything unusual. Later that night, I mentioned it to my boyfriend when he got home from work, but he brushed it off. In the following days, I started hearing more noises and sensing strange presences, both good and evil, and it was unsettling. Eventually, my boyfriend's job wrapped up, and we moved away for work. After we left, he admitted that after my experience, he started waking up every day at 3 a.m., wide awake, feeling uneasy too. The kicker? About a month after we moved out, we found out that an entire family had been murdered in that house, and we were the first people to rent it afterward. Story 36. When I was 9, my family moved into a rental house that felt unremarkable, neither old nor new, just like any other home in the neighborhood. However, I had 2 eerie experiences there that I didn't share with my family until after we moved out, and my siblings could relate to one of them. The first experience was more of a vibe than a specific event. Whenever I passed my parents' bedroom closet, I felt an unsettling awareness, as if something unseen was watching me, causing the hairs on my body to stand up. I avoided looking inside, convinced I would see eyes staring back. My sister later mustered the courage to peek in and claimed she saw a pair of yellow eyes. On the few occasions I entered the closet, always with my parents present, it felt noticeably colder than the rest of the house, which was odd given that it was surrounded by trees and rarely got direct sunlight. I eventually learned that a couple had lived there years before us, and during a heated argument, the wife shot her husband in that very closet. I still don't know if either of them died, just a rumor from a neighborhood kid. The second experience was more intense. One night, I was abruptly awakened by a woman screaming in my ear. I looked around my dark room, but no one was there. Additionally, I had vivid dreams about my parents dying while living there. One dream felt so real that I got up in the middle of the night to check on my dad, just to ensure he was okay. He's still alive. As a bonus, it seemed any paranormal activity in the house was more attracted to my younger sister, who was about 6 or 7 at the time. One night while I was away at camp, she woke up to see me standing in the doorway. Confused, she tried to talk to me, but I didn't respond and just stared at her before turning down the hallway toward our parents' room. Thankfully, something prompted her to look at my empty, made bed, making her realize it couldn't have been me. She also described seeing the disembodied face of a woman floating around our room at night, sometimes hovering over one of us. Overall, I'm grateful we didn't stay long, especially since my experiences were far less spooky than hers. Story 37. A few summers ago, I spent the night at my friend's house, which was built in the early 1800s or maybe the early 1900s. A former resident had reportedly shot himself in the garage, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After falling asleep on the couch while watching something with my friend, I woke up alone to the sound of heavy rain and a completely blue TV screen, the clock reading around 3 a.m. That's when I started hearing heavy footsteps on the wooden floors in the hallway. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was my friend or her sister, but the noise escalated until I turned to ask them to quiet down. To my horror, I saw a girl or woman with dark hair in a white dress staring at me. I immediately looked away and didn't dare look back. The footsteps continued for a few more minutes before I eventually fell asleep to the sound of the rain. When I told the family, they shrugged it off, but I was convinced I had witnessed something paranormal and avoided the house for a long time. Eventually, I agreed to sleep over again, this time not in the living room. While not much happened that night, I felt extremely sick the next morning and had to pull over on the way home to vomit. Afterward, I felt completely fine, which struck me as odd. Over the following visits, I experienced unsettling shadows darting down the hallway when no one else was around and persistent feelings of nausea. The unease was so strong that I often felt sick, but it always subsided once I left. The most recent incident occurred when I was home alone, making tomato soup. As I paced around the kitchen, I noticed the front door wide open. This was strange since it was a heavy door that I was sure had been shut. I closed and deadbolted it, then returned to check on my soup. A few minutes later, as I walked to the table with my bowl, I saw the door had been unlocked and opened again. Freaked out, I locked it once more. My brother arrived to pick me up about 10 to 20 minutes later, and since then, nothing paranormal has happened at that house, to my knowledge. Story 38. When I was about 15 or 16, I had a nightly ritual of listening to Sigur Rós before bed, but I always sensed an unsettling presence in my parents' house. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt something enter my room, an intense awareness, as if someone were watching me. It came from the hallway, made its way to the foot of my bed, and then lingered in the corner of the room. This time, instead of fleeing or covering my face to force myself to sleep, I decided to interact. I called out, "If there's anything in this room, and you can understand me, give me a sign." Almost immediately, my CD player, which had been playing fine for months, erupted in a loud, white noise static, growing louder as if it were turning itself up. I lay frozen, thinking, What have I done? After a few seconds, I firmly said stop, and just like that, the static ceased and Sigur Rós resumed playing. I experienced a few other strange occurrences in that house, but nothing quite as intense. Story 39. When I was around 7 or 8, my family rented a beach house for a week. The drive wasn't long, but by the time we arrived, I really needed to find a bathroom. As we pulled into the driveway, a middle-aged woman, the owner, greeted us and showed us around, sharing tips about the town. My first thought was to locate the bathroom, so I asked her where it was. She told me it was the second door on the right after the kitchen. I opened the bathroom door, only to find an older man just standing there, staring at me. I quickly ducked my head, muttered an apology, and bolted back outside. My family noticed I returned quickly, and I told them someone was in the bathroom. The woman looked puzzled and insisted no one else was in the house. After searching thoroughly, we found no sign of anyone else. Eventually, she revealed that her father had owned the house, had lived there, and had recently passed away. She inherited it and was unsure what to do with it, so she started renting it out. I'm pretty sure I saw him. Story 40. My family home was a large, detached stone building from the 1880s in the UK, adorned with traditional decor, antiques, and paintings. The attic and cellars were expansive, making them feel like entirely different floors. As a child, I was terrified to explore them alone, and even in my early 20s, I found the house unsettling when I was by myself. A series of strange occurrences happened there. I once woke up to my chest of drawers shaking against the wall, while my sister found the taps in her bedroom turning on by themselves multiple times during the night. A group of friends also swore they saw a face in a mirror looking back at them from across the room. One night, I woke to see a dark figure standing near my door. When I approached, it retreated onto the landing and vanished before I could reach it. I asked my parents the next day, but neither had been up during the night. Years later, in my late teens, I saw a similar black figure walking up the stairs into the attic, and I distinctly remember watching it move through the closed door. At the time, I dismissed these encounters as products of my imagination, but only recently did I connect the two sightings, realizing they were likely the same cloaked figure gliding through the house. Interestingly, when I first saw the figure as a kid, I wasn't scared. I felt an inexplicable urge to follow it, despite usually hiding under the blankets from fear. The second sighting rattled me more. A few years later, while alone in my 20s and playing the piano, I heard a clatter and turned to find the lid of a metronome box had dropped in the middle of the room, with no explanation for how it could have happened. Recently, I received an email from a former housemate who had moved back into my old room. She mentioned struggling with sleep, experiencing strange nightmares, and sleep paralysis. Initially, I dismissed her concerns, thinking they were just superstitions. But upon reflection, I remembered having gruesome, recurring nightmares while living there, dreams of being chased and committing violent acts in vivid detail. I hadn't experienced those nightmares since moving out. When I mentioned it to my girlfriend, the first thing she said was, "Yeah, you had those nightmares, didn't you? Strange." Story 41. It wasn't a particularly scary moment for me, but it terrified my sister and her friend. Years ago, I used to visit haunted houses all the time for Halloween, and eventually I started bringing my sister and one of her friends along. One year, we ventured farther than usual and spotted a mysterious white pillar in the middle of nowhere, so we decided to check it out at 1 a.m., of course. As we got closer, we realized it was in a cemetery, and the only way in was through a small stretch of a farmer's property. This meant crawling under a fence, crossing a small field, and jumping over some barbed wire. Nothing too difficult. But halfway through the field, we heard something following us, and we froze. Looking around, we discovered it was just a horse that had taken an interest in us. I laughed it off and kept going. Later, I learned that my sister and her friend were on the verge of panicking at the sight of the horse, which seemed to shadow us without getting too close or backing off. When we had to return through the same field, I had to practically drag them over the fence because they were so frightened. It took my sister a few years to overcome her fear of horses, and to this day, I still enjoy teasing her about it. Story 42. A few friends and I enjoy exploring abandoned places and capturing striking photographs, often focusing on those urban and forgotten themes. We always adhere to a strict code, never taking anything or causing damage. Before each outing, we equip ourselves with gas masks and flashlights, and we monitor police radios to understand patrol patterns in the areas we plan to explore. We've done this many times, sharing our photos on a blog, so we take care to be responsible. Recently, my friend discovered an abandoned mental hospital about 40 minutes from our town. He assured us it was completely deserted and safe. So, around 10 p.m., we arrived, climbed over a fence, and stepped onto the hospital grounds. The first floor was unremarkable, and our gas masks kept us safe from any airborne hazards. However, the second floor had a creepier atmosphere. We encountered dirty mattresses and folders containing personal files, which revealed unsettling mugshot-like photos of former patients. We chose not to photograph those out of respect for their privacy. The mood shifted even more when we stumbled upon satanic graffiti and a tall cross propped in the middle of a hallway. As we absorbed our surroundings, an unusual sense of unease washed over me, despite having explored creepier places like a church and an orphanage. As we approached the stairs to the third floor, strange occurrences intensified. Although we believed the building was empty, we heard footsteps above us. The floor felt solid enough to muffle sound, which only added to our discomfort. We spotted tall shadows moving past doorways and heard faint whispers. Eager to escape that unsettling floor, we climbed the stairs to the last level. Then, something made its presence known. We all heard a bone-chilling scream, unlike anything I had ever encountered. Part scream, part roar, and amplified by the narrow stairwell. Without exchanging a word, our group of teenage guys who prided ourselves on our bravery bolted down the stairs, sprinted to the car, and sped away. To this day, we have no idea what happened in that hospital, and while we occasionally revisit other sites, we vowed never to return to this one. Story 43. In my 20 years of living, I've been in many houses and apartments, but nothing has frightened me quite like the home I lived in when I was around 8. Though I'm not sure when it was built, I believe it dates back to the 1920s. It was a 2-story, 4-bedroom, 2.5-bathroom house. I had my own room upstairs while my sister was next door, my mom was down the hall, and my grandma stayed in a spare room downstairs. I lived there for about 3 years, and during my last year, something unforgettable happened. Over several nights, I woke up in the middle of the night but thought nothing of it. Then one night, around 2:30 a.m., I woke up again. As I tried to drift back to sleep, I felt an unsettling presence in my room, seemingly emanating from my closet. Normally, I always kept it closed, but that night it was wide open. Peering into the darkness, I discerned a figure, a woman with faint red eyes, sitting on the floor with her arms wrapped around her knees. My mind raced. What the hell? All of this unfolded within 5 minutes. Panicking, I turned to face the wall, pulled the blankets over my head, and somehow fell asleep. The next morning, I recounted the experience to my family. My grandma immediately called my cousin after I described what I saw. Being Native American, we decided to burn sage for protection. I moved into my grandma's bedroom while she took my room. Eventually, my grandma moved out to live with my aunt, and my uncle came to stay with us. My mom told him about the closet lady, and he moved into my old room. After I moved downstairs, I didn't see the lady anymore, though I had encountered her in the laundry room a year earlier. I often noticed black silhouettes of people, and even guests would mention seeing them, despite us never telling them about the strange happenings. One night, while my siblings were at my aunt's house and my mom was out, my uncle was home alone. As he walked upstairs, he spotted a tall man staring into my old room. We moved out that summer, and shortly afterward, my mom learned from our landlord that a family had previously lived in that house and all died there under tragic circumstances. She mentioned that after we left, a new family moved in, and one of them killed the others with a katana. Whenever my friends share scary stories, I always tell them about the closet lady, and it never fails to give them chills. Story 44. My grandmother lives in the Dominican Republic, very close to a cemetery known for occasional black magic practices. My cousin and I often went there to smoke weed, but one night everything changed. After a typical outing, I stayed at her house, but when it was time for bed, an uneasy feeling settled over us. It was as if someone was watching us, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, accompanied by a creeping fear that made me shake. My cousin sensed it too, but despite her discomfort, she eventually fell asleep, tossing and turning. I tried to wake her, but she didn't respond. After about an hour, she suddenly woke up, staring intently into the corner of the room. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. She screamed for whatever was there to leave, and then we heard a massive bang, as if someone had slammed the front door, followed by the sound of wood splintering. I wanted to check it out, but an overwhelming sense of dread held me in place, convincing me I might die if I did. We sat there frozen in fear, hearing stomping and doors slamming throughout the house. Time felt like it was stretching on for hours. Eventually, we mustered the courage to get out of bed. To our relief, all the doors were as we had left them, including the front door, which was intact. When I asked my cousin what she had seen, she described a terrifying dream where a man attacked her, and just before she woke up, he whispered, "You're mine now." She had seen that same man standing in the corner of her room. With the lights on, I noticed scratches appearing all over her arms, neck, and legs, as if they had developed over time. After that night, my cousin was haunted by this entity for about a year and a half. I eventually stopped visiting her because I couldn't bear the fear of feeling watched at night, and I stopped inviting her over, knowing the presence seemed to follow her wherever she went. Story 45. This happened about 5 years ago during summer in college. My housemate was out with his girlfriend, leaving me home alone. After a quiet night, I grew tired and went to bed around midnight, closing my door to avoid being disturbed when my roommate returned. We had a dog who usually slept in his little bed in the living room. About 30 minutes after I settled in, I heard what sounded like the front door opening and being fiddled with. I initially thought it was my roommate, but there were no footsteps. Our tile floors made it easy to hear someone walking around. Then I began to hear strange percussive noises, and my dog started barking furiously, which unnerved me since he rarely barked at anything. He came over to my door, whining and clawing at it, and I could feel my hair stand on end knowing he was scared. Suddenly, I heard the computer chair in the living room roll across the floor, prompting the dog to bark even louder. There was no way I was opening that door. I was terrified. After a few minutes, the barking subsided and the noises stopped, but I was wide awake, heart racing. Throughout the ordeal, I didn't hear any footsteps. I sat there for 2 hours until my roommate finally came home with his girlfriend. I told them what had happened, and she freaked out and left. I didn't get a wink of sleep the rest of the night. Story 46. 2 experiences stand out in my memory, both strangely similar, and I've only shared them with a few people. When I was around 12 or 13, I lived with my parents and my bedroom was in the basement, the only one down there. I can't recall which incident happened first since it's been about 10 years, but here's how I remember it. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of a young girl repeatedly yelling, "Fire." I should note that I don't have a younger sister. The only other people in the house were my mom, dad, and my younger brother, who is 4 years younger than me. I threw off my blankets, jumped out of bed, and sprinted down the hallway, skipping every other step up the stairs. Once I reached the top, I paused in the dark kitchen. I didn't smell smoke or see any signs of a fire. I made my way to my parents' bedroom, where everything was silent. They were both sound asleep, and my brother was directly across the hall. I crossed over to his room and found him, too, fast asleep. Confused, I stood there for a moment, and as realization set in, chills ran down my spine. I cautiously returned to my bedroom and lay down, struggling to sleep the rest of the night. Later, I was again awakened around the same time, this time by the sound of a small child or girl sobbing. Thinking it was my brother, I headed upstairs to comfort him. But as I reached the top, it was eerily quiet. I assumed he had heard me coming and was trying to stay quiet. I entered his room, only to find him sound asleep, lying on his back with his head turned towards me. I could see clearly that he hadn't been crying. If it had been me, I would have buried my face in my pillow to avoid being detected. The familiarity of this situation sent chills through me again. I made my way back to my room and crawled into bed, once more struggling to sleep. I lived in that house with my parents for nearly 20 years, and aside from one other paranormal experience, when a close friend of mine passed away in a tragic car accident, and I saw him standing in my doorway while lying in bed, which was more comforting than frightening. I never encountered anything like those 2 nights before or after. We were only the second family to live in that house, and no one, especially a little girl, had ever died there. Story 47. My parents have been renting a house from my aunt since I was 2 years old. Now that I'm 28 and have moved out, I still remember all the strange things that happened there. things my siblings and parents couldn't explain. The house has just one bathroom, which includes a shower and toilet. So sometimes one person would shower while another needed to use the toilet. One morning, when my dad was in the shower, my sister and I were in the living room, right next to the bathroom. No one else was awake. My mom and brother were still asleep. We were leaning against the bathroom door when, suddenly, we heard 3 distinct knocks on it. My dad even called out, "Come in," thinking someone was there. My sister and I freaked out and ran screaming out of the house, prompting my mom to come out and ask what was wrong. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. It happened several times, even on other doors, including the front door. Each time we checked, no one was there. There were also tense moments in our family, and my mom was convinced my dad was possessed. She claimed to have seen dark, hunched figures crawling toward her at night, which made her get up and pray for them to go away. In my bedroom, I often saw glowing orbs with the lights off, and even my mom and sister could see them too. So much happened in that house that defies explanation. Sometimes I feel certain places have a thin barrier between our world and the paranormal, and that house is definitely one of them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.